"She's just the maid!" my DIL shouted for everyone to hear at her wedding. I made just one hand gesture, and a waiter turned on the TV. When everyone saw who I really was, my DIL simply fainted. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I never imagined that after 63 years of life, I would be standing in the corner of a wedding reception, clutching a small purse from Walmart, feeling more invisible than I had ever felt before. The ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton sparkled with crystal chandeliers, white roses, and the kind of elegance that screamed money. Real money. The kind I had never been part of, even though I was the mother of the groom. My son Neil looked handsome in his custom tuxedo, his dark hair slicked back perfectly, shaking hands with men in expensive suits who probably spent more on their watches than I made in a year. At 38, he had become everything I had worked so hard to help him achieve. Successful, refined, accepted by the kind of people who mattered in this city. But as I watched him from across the room, I felt a familiar ache in my chest. The same ache I had carried for years, watching my son grow further and further away from the woman who had raised him. I smoothed down my navy blue dress, the nicest one I owned, purchased on clearance from JCPenney 3 months ago specifically for this day. I had spent weeks trying to find something appropriate, something that wouldn't embarrass Neil on his wedding day. The fabric felt cheap against my skin compared to the silk and satin flowing around me, worn by women who belonged in this world. Ainsley glided across the room in her designer wedding gown, a vision of perfection with her platinum blonde hair swept into an elaborate updo, diamonds glittering at her throat and ears. She was everything I wasn't: young, beautiful, polished. Born into the kind of wealth that I had only glimpsed from the outside, working as a secretary for 40 years to put my son through medical school. I had been standing by the gift table for 20 minutes, watching the celebration unfold around me, when I finally gathered the courage to approach the head table. It was time to congratulate my son properly, to maybe get a photograph together, something I could frame and put on my small kitchen table back home. "Neil, sweetheart," I said softly as I approached, my voice barely audible over the string quartet playing in the corner. He turned, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Was it embarrassment? Annoyance? The expression was gone so quickly I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. "Mom," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You look nice." The pause before nice hung in the air like a judgment. I could feel the eyes of his new in-laws on me, taking in my modest dress, my simple pearl earrings that had been my mother's, my practical black pumps with the scuffed toes. "I wanted to congratulate you both," I said, turning to include Ainsley in my smile. The ceremony was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Ainsley's smile was the kind that never reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice crisp and perfectly modulated. Everything about her was perfect. Her posture, her makeup, the way she held her champagne flute like she had been born to it. I had brought a gift, a small jewelry box I had found at an antique store. It wasn't expensive, but it was beautiful, with intricate carved details and a soft velvet interior. I had saved for months to buy it, thinking it would be something special, something meaningful. "I have something for you," I said to Ainsley, reaching into my purse. But before I could pull out the wrapped box, Ainsley's expression changed. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the guests who were beginning to notice our interaction. Important people, wealthy people, people whose opinions mattered to her. "Oh, that's really not necessary," she said quickly, her voice rising slightly. "You've done enough already." I felt my cheeks burn. Done enough? What did that mean? I hadn't done anything except show up to my own son's wedding. "Ainsley," Neil said quietly, but she wasn't listening. The conversation at nearby tables had begun to quiet. I could feel more eyes turning toward us, curious about the interaction between the stunning bride and the older woman in the discount dress. "Mother," Neil said, using the formal tone he had adopted years ago, "maybe you should find your seat. The dinner service is about to begin." I looked around, suddenly realizing I didn't know where I was supposed to sit. In all the excitement and preparation, no one had told me about the seating arrangements. I had assumed I would be at the family table, close to my son on his wedding day. "Where am I sitting?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ainsley's face went pale, then flushed pink. She glanced around the room again, at all the important faces watching our exchange, and something in her expression hardened. "She's just the help," she said loudly, her voice carrying across the nearby tables. "She's only the maid." The words hit me like a physical blow. The room seemed to tilt, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Conversation stopped completely now. Every head at the surrounding tables turned to stare at us. "Ainsley," Neil said, his voice sharp with warning. But she was in full panic mode now, trying to salvage what she saw as a social disaster. "I mean, she works for us. She helps around the house. We thought it would be nice to include her, but really, she shouldn't be bothering the wedding party." I stood there, frozen, as the lie settled over the room like a thick blanket. The wealthy guests nodded in understanding, their expressions shifting from curiosity to mild disapproval. Of course, that explained the cheap dress, the awkward approach, the simple gift. I was just the help, overstepping my boundaries. My hands trembled as I clutched my purse tighter. 63 years old, and I was being dismissed like a servant who had forgotten her place, by my own son's wife, in front of everyone who mattered to them. Neil said nothing. He just stood there, his face carefully blank, and said nothing to defend me. I felt tears prick at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of these people who were already looking at me like I was something pitiful. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I caught the eye of a young waiter who was standing near the bar, adjusting the large television mounted on the wall. It was currently showing a slideshow of Neil and Ainsley's engagement photos, but I had noticed earlier that it could be switched to live television. I raised my hand slightly and nodded toward the TV. The waiter, probably thinking I was someone important giving him a signal, reached for the remote. "What are you doing?" Ainsley hissed, but I didn't answer. The wedding guests were still watching, still whispering among themselves about the awkward scene they had just witnessed. Some looked sympathetic, others simply uncomfortable, but they were all watching, and they were about to see something that would change everything. The waiter clicked the remote, and the engagement photos disappeared, replaced by the local evening news. I stood there, my heart pounding, waiting for the segment I knew was coming. The segment that would reveal exactly who the maid really was. Ainsley was about to learn that calling someone just the help could be the biggest mistake of your life. Standing there in that opulent ballroom, humiliated and dismissed, my mind drifted back to where it all began. To the tiny two-bedroom apartment where I raised Neil alone, working double shifts just to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. I was 25 when my husband died in a construction accident, leaving me with a 3-year-old son and no life insurance. Back then, there was no time for grief, no luxury of falling apart. I had a child to raise and bills to pay, so I did what I had to do. I took a job as a secretary at Morrison & Associates, a small accounting firm downtown, $40 a week, which was barely enough to cover rent, let alone everything else. So I took on extra work, typing manuscripts at night for local writers, taking in sewing and alterations, babysitting neighborhood kids on weekends. I lived on 3 hours of sleep and instant coffee, but Neil never went without. When he was old enough for school, I made sure it was the best school I could afford. That meant working overtime every week, saving every penny, shopping at thrift stores, and buying generic groceries. I wore the same 3 dresses to work for years, rotating them and mending them until they were more patches than original fabric. Neil was a smart boy, the smartest in his class. His teachers said he had potential, that he could go to college if we started planning early. So, I planned. I worked extra shifts at the accounting firm, took on more typing jobs, even cleaned offices on weekends. Every spare dollar went into a coffee can hidden in my bedroom closet, Neil's college fund. But as he got older, I started to notice changes in him. He became embarrassed by our small apartment, by my secondhand clothes, by the fact that I took the bus while his classmates' mothers drove nice cars. When he was 12, he asked me to drop him off a block away from school so the other kids wouldn't see me. "Mom, you don't understand," he had said when I tried to talk to him about it. "They make fun of kids whose families are different. Different. That's what we were. Poor, but he couldn't say that word." I started working even harder, determined to give him everything those other kids had. I took a second job as a night janitor at the local hospital, mopping floors and emptying trash cans from midnight to 6 a.m., then going straight to my day job at the accounting firm. I was exhausted all the time, running on adrenaline and determination, but Neil's grades were excellent, and his college fund was growing. When he was 16, Neil got his first part-time job at a country club on the other side of town. He started coming home with stories about the wealthy families he encountered there, their houses, their cars, their vacations to Europe. The way he talked about them, with such admiration and longing, made my heart ache. "Mrs. Harrison has a closet bigger than our entire apartment," he told me one evening, his eyes shining with something that looked like worship. "And they're sending their son to Harvard." "Harvard, Mom. Can you imagine?" I could imagine. I had been imagining it for him since he was 3 years old. "You'll go to a good college too," I assured him. "Maybe not Harvard, but somewhere wonderful where you can become anything you want." But that wasn't enough for Neil anymore. He had tasted a world I couldn't give him, and it had changed him. He started lying to his co-workers about where we lived, claiming we had a house in a better neighborhood. He would meet me 3 blocks away from the country club so no one would see my beat-up car. The worst part was watching him look at me with something that broke my heart: shame. He was ashamed of me, of my worn hands and tired face, of the way I pronounced certain words, of my simple clothes and practical shoes. I was everything he wanted to escape from. Still, I kept working. I picked up a 3rd job doing bookkeeping for small businesses on weekends. I lived on peanut butter sandwiches and store-brand soup so Neil could have proper meals. I darned my stockings and resoled my shoes while he got new clothes for school. When it came time for college applications, Neil had his heart set on the state's most prestigious university, the same one where all the wealthy kids from the country club were going. The tuition was astronomical, more than I made in 2 years, but I had been saving for 15 years. Between the coffee can fund, some small investments I had managed to make, and the financial aid he qualified for, we could just barely make it work. "Are you sure about this, honey?" I asked him the night before we sent in his enrollment papers. "There are other good schools, ones that might be more affordable." He looked at me with such determination, such desperate hope, that I knew there was no other choice. "Mom, this is my chance," he said. "This is how I make something of myself. This is how I become someone important." The unspoken words hung between us. Someone better than you? So I worked even harder. I took loans against my small savings, picked up additional cleaning contracts, and sold my mother's wedding ring to pay for his textbooks. When Neil needed money for social activities, for the right clothes to fit in with his wealthy classmates, I found a way to provide it. I watched my son transform during those college years. His accent became more refined, his vocabulary more sophisticated. He learned about wine and art and classical music, things I had never had the time or money to explore. He was becoming the cultured, educated man I had always dreamed he could be, but he was also moving further away from me. By his senior year, Neil rarely called home. When he did visit, which was seldom, he would critique our neighborhood, suggest I move somewhere safer, comment on how I could improve myself if I tried harder. He meant well, I told myself. He just wanted better for both of us. After graduation, Neil was accepted to medical school. More years of sacrifice, more loans, more 60-hour work weeks, but I did it gladly because I could see the finish line. I could see the life I had worked so hard to give him finally coming into focus. He became Dr. Neil Morrison, graduated magna cum laude, and landed a residency at the city's most prestigious hospital. I was so proud I could barely contain it. This was what all those years of struggle had been for. But success changed him even more. He moved into an expensive apartment downtown, bought a luxury car, joined an exclusive gym. He started dating women from prominent families, taking vacations to places I couldn't even pronounce. And slowly, steadily, I became an embarrassment to him. He would visit less and less, always with some excuse about his demanding schedule. When he did come by, he would suggest I redecorate, update my wardrobe, take some classes to broaden my horizons. He never said it directly, but the message was clear. I needed to become someone different if I wanted to remain part of his new life. Then he met Ainsley Pemberton. She was everything he had always wanted: beautiful, sophisticated, from a wealthy family with connections throughout the city. When Neil brought her home to meet me the first time, I could see the way she looked at my modest apartment, my simple dinner, my carefully chosen, but obviously inexpensive outfit, the way she looked at me. "Your mother is charming," she told Neil later, not realizing I could hear them talking in the hallway. "She did her best," he replied, and I heard the apology in his voice. The shame. That night, I sat in my small living room, surrounded by photos of Neil's childhood, his graduations, his achievements, and I realized something that shattered my heart into a million pieces. I had succeeded in giving my son everything he wanted, and in doing so, I had made myself someone he no longer wanted to be associated with. Now, standing in this ballroom where he was starting his new life with Ainsley, dismissed as just the help, I understood that all those years of sacrifice had led to this moment. My son had gotten everything I had worked to give him: success, status, acceptance into a world I could never belong to. But he had lost something too, something I was about to remind him of. The television screen flickered, and I saw the news anchor shuffling her papers. In just a few moments, everyone in this room was going to learn exactly who they had just humiliated, and my son was about to discover that the mother he was ashamed of had become someone even he couldn't have imagined. 3 years ago, my world changed in a way I never could have predicted. But that night in the ballroom, watching Ainsley's panicked face as she tried to explain away her cruel words, I remembered exactly how it all began. It was a Tuesday morning in October when my life took an unexpected turn. I was sitting at my desk at Morrison & Associates, typing up quarterly reports like I had done every day for nearly 40 years, when my boss called me into his office. "Dolores, there's a gentleman here to see you," Mr. Morrison said, his expression unusually serious. "He says it's about an inheritance." I almost laughed. An inheritance? The only family I had left was Neil, and I certainly wasn't expecting anything from anyone else. But the man sitting across from Mr. Morrison's desk was real enough. Expensive suit, briefcase, the kind of confident bearing that spoke of serious business. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, standing to shake my hand. "I'm Richard Fleming, estate attorney for the late Harold Morrison." My breath caught. Harold Morrison had been my husband's business partner back in the early 1980s, before the construction accident that killed my husband. I hadn't heard from Harold in decades. "I'm sorry to hear about Harold's passing," I said, genuinely saddened. Harold had been kind to me after my husband died, helping with funeral arrangements and making sure I received all the workers' compensation I was entitled to. "Mr. Morrison passed away last month," Fleming continued, "and I'm here because you're named as a beneficiary in his will." I stared at him, certain I had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" Fleming opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Harold Morrison left you a significant inheritance, Mrs. Morrison. Specifically, 40% ownership in Morrison Tech Solutions." The name meant nothing to me. I had never heard of Morrison Tech Solutions. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Fleming smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he enjoyed delivering unexpected good news. "Let me explain. After your husband died, Harold used his life insurance payout to start a small computer software company. He always said your husband would have been his partner if he had lived, so he considered you the rightful owner of his share." My head was spinning. But that was 40 years ago. I never heard anything about this company. "Harold was very private about his business affairs," Fleming explained. "The company struggled for years, barely making a profit. But about 10 years ago, they developed a data management system that revolutionized inventory tracking for major corporations. The company went public 5 years ago." He slid a document across the desk toward me. The numbers on the page didn't make sense at first. Too many zeros. It had to be a mistake. "Mrs. Morrison, your 40% stake in Morrison Tech Solutions is currently valued at approximately $87 million. The world tilted. I gripped the edge of the desk, certain I was about to faint. $87 million. It was an impossible number, more money than I could even conceptualize. "There must be some mistake," I whispered. "No mistake," Fleming assured me. "Harold was very specific in his will. He said your husband would have been proud of what the company became, and he wanted to make sure you were taken care of. The board has been paying dividends into a trust fund for you for the past 5 years, but Harold insisted the principal inheritance wait until after his death." I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the papers that had just changed everything. For 40 years, I had scraped and saved, worked multiple jobs, denied myself every comfort to provide for my son. And all along, there had been this fortune waiting for me. What happens now? I managed to ask. Now, you become one of the wealthiest women in the state, Fleming said with another smile. The company is doing very well. Your annual dividends alone will be more than most people make in a lifetime. The meeting lasted another hour, with Fleming explaining stock options, board meetings, and financial advisors. But I barely heard any of it. My mind was reeling with the implications of what had just happened. I could pay off every debt. I could buy a beautiful house, a new car, travel the world if I wanted to. I could give Neil everything he had ever dreamed of having. But as I sat there, listening to Fleming discuss investment strategies and tax implications, something held me back from immediately sharing this news with my son. Maybe it was the memory of our last conversation 3 weeks earlier, when Neil had called to tell me about his engagement to Ainsley. He had been different on the phone, distant and formal, like he was checking an obligation off his list. I wanted you to hear it from me first, he had said. Ainsley and I are getting married next month. Oh, Neil, that's wonderful, I had exclaimed, genuinely happy for him. I can't wait to meet her properly. There had been a pause. Mom, about the wedding. It's going to be pretty formal. High-end venue. Ainsley's family is very particular about these things. Of course, sweetheart, I understand. Do you think? Would it be possible for you to get something nice to wear? I could send you some money if you need it. The words had stung, even though I knew he meant well. My son was offering to buy me clothes so I wouldn't embarrass him at his own wedding. I'll find something appropriate, I had told him. Great. And Mom? Maybe we could talk about getting you moved to a nicer neighborhood after the wedding. I worry about you in that area. He worried about me, or he worried about what people would think when they found out where his mother lived. That conversation had planted a seed of doubt in my mind about Neil's motivations, about whether he truly saw me as a person or just as a problem to be managed. So, when Fleming handed me those papers that changed everything, I made a decision that surprised even me. I decided to keep the inheritance secret, not forever, just long enough to see who my son really was when he thought I had nothing to offer him except myself. Fleming helped me set up the paperwork to keep the inheritance private. The money was invested conservatively, generating enough income to live comfortably while keeping the principal untouched. I moved to a slightly better apartment, nothing too dramatic that would raise questions, and continued working at Morrison & Associates, though I could have bought the company outright. Over the next 3 years, I watched my son carefully. I observed how he interacted with me, how he spoke about me to others, how he treated me when Ainsley was around versus when we were alone. What I discovered broke my heart in ways I hadn't expected. Neil wasn't ashamed of my poverty. He was ashamed of me. Even when I tried to dress better, when I moved to a nicer apartment, when I attempted to be the kind of mother he could be proud of, nothing changed. In his mind, I would always be the embarrassing reminder of where he came from. The worst revelation came 6 months ago, when I overheard a phone conversation between Neil and Ainsley. I had arrived early for dinner at his apartment and used my key to let myself in, thinking I would surprise them with groceries for the meal I had offered to cook. She's just going to be a problem, Neil, Ainsley was saying from the bedroom. Your mother doesn't understand our world. She never will. I know, Neil replied, his voice heavy with resignation. But she's my mother. I can't just cut her off completely. Why not? She adds nothing to your life except obligation and embarrassment. When we have children, do you really want them associating with someone like that? Someone like that. As if I were something distasteful, something to be hidden away. Maybe after we're married, I can set her up somewhere further away, Neil said. Find her a nice little place in Florida or something. She could make friends with people more her speed. I stood in their kitchen, holding groceries I had bought with money they couldn't even imagine, listening to my son plan to exile me from his life, like I was an inconvenient relative. That night, I made another decision. I would attend Neil's wedding, and I would let them treat me exactly as they saw me, as someone beneath them, someone disposable. But I would also make sure that everyone at that wedding learned exactly who they were really dealing with. I had spent months planning this moment, working with Fleming and a few other people to ensure that tonight's revelation would be impossible to ignore or explain away. The news segment about Morrison Tech Solutions' latest acquisition was scheduled to air at exactly this time, and it would feature an interview with the company's largest individual shareholder. Me. Standing in that ballroom, having just been dismissed as the help by my own son's wife, I felt a cold satisfaction settle over me. They wanted to play games about class and worth and belonging. They were about to discover that they had picked the wrong opponent. The news anchor on the television screen looked up from her papers, and I heard her say the words I had been waiting for. Tonight's business report features an exclusive interview with one of our state's most influential investors. Ainsley was still trying to manage the social damage from her outburst, smiling nervously at the wedding guests who were whispering among themselves. Neil stood beside her, his face carefully blank, still refusing to acknowledge what his wife had just done to his own mother. But in just a few moments, their entire world was about to crumble, and I was going to watch it happen with the same cold satisfaction they had shown me for years. What happened next would have been impossible without the investigation I had been conducting for the past 18 months. As I stood there in that ballroom, waiting for the news segment that would change everything, I thought about how it all began with a simple inconsistency in Ainsley's story. It was during their engagement party last year when I first noticed something was off. Ainsley had been holding court with a group of Neil's medical colleagues, regaling them with stories about her privileged upbringing. "Oh yes, the Pemberton estate has been in our family for generations," she was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone of casual arrogance that comes with inherited wealth. "Daddy always said we were descended from the original settlers, you know, very old money." She spoke about her childhood with the kind of detail that suggested deep familiarity. Summers in the Hamptons, private schools in Switzerland, debutante balls where she wore her grandmother's diamonds. Every story was perfectly crafted, delivered with just the right amount of humble bragging that made her seem sophisticated rather than boastful. But something nagged at me about the way she told these stories. There was a rehearsed quality to them, like she had practiced the details until they became second nature. The first real red flag came when she mentioned her father's business. "Daddy's in international banking," she said to Dr. Williams, Neil's department head. "Pemberton Financial has offices in London, Geneva, and New York. Very boring stuff, really, but it keeps us comfortable." I was standing nearby, refilling water glasses like the good hostess I was trying to be, when Dr. Williams's expression shifted slightly. "Pemberton Financial," he repeated. "I don't think I'm familiar with that firm. Which bank are they affiliated with?" For just a moment, Ainsley's perfect composure flickered. "Oh, it's very specialized," she said quickly. "Mostly private clients, very discreet. Daddy doesn't like to advertise." Dr. Williams nodded politely, but I caught the skeptical look he exchanged with his wife. In their world, if you were wealthy enough to matter, people knew your family's business. That small interaction planted a seed of doubt in my mind, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I was just looking for reasons to dislike Ainsley because I could see how she looked at me, like I was something unfortunate that needed to be tolerated. But then came the incident with the photographs. 2 months later, I was at Neil's apartment helping him prepare for a dinner party when Ainsley arrived with what she claimed were family photos to show his colleagues. "I thought people might enjoy seeing some pictures from the Pemberton estate," she said, pulling out an elegant leather album. "The gardens are really quite spectacular in spring." I glanced over her shoulder as she opened the album, and my blood went cold. The photos were beautiful, a magnificent mansion with manicured grounds, elegant interior shots that belonged in a magazine. But something was wrong with one of the pictures. In a family photo supposedly taken last Christmas, Ainsley stood with an older couple in front of a massive Christmas tree. The woman was meant to be her mother, I assumed, and the man her father. But I had seen that exact photo before, in a magazine article about luxury holiday decorating. I knew this because I had torn out that article and saved it in a folder of decorating ideas. A silly indulgence for someone who could barely afford to redecorate her small apartment. The photo in Ainsley's album was identical to the one in the magazine, except that Ainsley's face had been expertly photoshopped onto the daughter in the original image. I said nothing that night, but my suspicions were now impossible to ignore. I started paying closer attention to Ainsley's stories, looking for inconsistencies, details that didn't quite add up, and there were many. She claimed to have attended an exclusive boarding school in Connecticut, but when I casually mentioned that my friend's daughter had gone to the same school around the same time, Ainsley quickly changed the subject. She talked about family trips to Europe, but her knowledge of the places she claimed to have visited seemed to come entirely from travel websites rather than personal experience. Most tellingly, she never received calls from family members. In the year I had known her, I had never seen her take a phone call from her mother, never heard her mention plans to visit her supposedly wealthy parents, never seen any evidence that the Pemberton family she described actually existed. That's when I made the decision to hire a private investigator. I had never done anything like that in my life, but my newfound wealth made it possible. Richard Fleming had recommended a discreet investigation firm that specialized in background checks for high-net-worth individuals. I need to know who Ainsley Pemberton really is, I told the investigator, a middle-aged woman named Sarah Chen who had 20 years of experience in corporate security. Any particular reason for the inquiry? Sarah asked, her tone professional and non-judgmental. Call it a mother's intuition, I said. Something about her story doesn't add up. Sarah's investigation took 3 months, and what she uncovered was worse than I had imagined. Ainsley Pemberton didn't exist. The woman my son was planning to marry was actually Ainsley Peterson, born in a working-class suburb of Detroit to parents who worked at an auto parts factory. She had attended public school, dropped out of community college after 1 semester, and had spent the past 15 years reinventing herself through a series of increasingly elaborate deceptions. She's good at what she does, Sarah explained during our final meeting. This isn't her first time creating a false identity to marry into wealth. She's done this at least twice before. Sarah slid a thick folder across the table toward me. Inside were documents that painted a picture of calculated deception spanning more than a decade. Ainsley Peterson had first appeared in Atlanta 5 years ago, calling herself Ainsley Pierce and claiming to be the daughter of a deceased oil executive. She had targeted and nearly married a young lawyer from a prominent Georgia family before his parents hired their own investigator and exposed her fraud. From Atlanta, she had moved to Charleston, where she became Amanda Prescott, supposedly the daughter of a shipping fortune. That identity lasted 2 years and netted her a brief marriage to a banker's son before his family discovered the truth and had the marriage annulled. She's constantly evolving her technique, Sarah explained. Each identity is more sophisticated than the last. The Pemberton persona is her masterpiece, completely fabricated background, but with enough believable details to fool most casual scrutiny. The folder contained copies of Ainsley's real birth certificate, her high school records, employment history at various retail jobs, and even mugshots from 2 arrests for credit card fraud in her early 20s. But the most damning evidence was a series of emails Sarah had uncovered through her contacts in digital forensics. Ainsley had been corresponding with someone who appeared to be coaching her on maintaining the Pemberton identity. Everything from etiquette lessons to art history tutorials to help her fake sophisticated knowledge. More disturbing were emails where Ainsley discussed her Mark, my son Neil. The doctor is perfect, she had written to her mysterious advisor. Successful enough to provide the lifestyle I want, but insecure enough about his own background to be impressed by fake pedigree. His mother is a problem, though. She watches me too closely. I need to find a way to minimize her influence. Reading those words, seeing my son reduced to a target in Ainsley's elaborate con game, filled me with a rage I had never experienced before, but it also gave me the weapon I needed. Sarah's investigation had uncovered enough evidence to expose Ainsley completely, but I decided to wait. I wanted to choose the perfect moment, the occasion where the revelation would have maximum impact, and where Ainsley would have no chance to explain it away or disappear. The wedding was ideal. Working with Sarah, I arranged for additional verification of Ainsley's real identity. We tracked down her actual family in Detroit, parents who were very much alive and working class, nothing like the dead banking magnate she claimed as a father. We obtained DNA samples that proved definitively who she really was. The final piece of evidence came from a genetic genealogy company. Ainsley had apparently taken one of their DNA tests years ago under her real name, probably for innocent reasons. but that test was still in their database, waiting to be matched. All I had to do was arrange for that information to become public at exactly the right moment. The local news station had been very interested in the story when Sarah's contacts approached them. A woman assuming false identities to marry into wealthy families was exactly the kind of scandal that drew viewers. They agreed to air an investigative segment about Ainsley Pemberton during their evening broadcast, tonight's broadcast. Standing in that ballroom, having just been humiliated by the very woman whose deception I was about to expose, I felt a sense of poetic justice that was almost overwhelming. Ashley thought she was so clever, so superior to the poor little secretary who had raised Neil. She had just dismissed me as hired help in front of everyone who mattered to her false identity. In a few minutes, she was going to discover that underestimating people could be a fatal mistake. The news anchor on the television was shuffling her papers, preparing for the next segment. I could see Ashley still trying to manage the social fallout from her outburst, smiling nervously at guests who were whispering among themselves. She had no idea that her entire carefully constructed world was about to collapse on live television, and this time, there would be nowhere for her to run. The news anchor looked directly into the camera, her expression serious and professional. "Good evening. Tonight we begin with an exclusive investigation into a pattern of identity fraud that has reached into some of our state's most prominent families." I watched as every head in the ballroom slowly turned toward the television. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the string quartet seemed to play more quietly, as if sensing that something important was happening. "Our investigation centers on a woman who has spent the past decade assuming false identities to infiltrate wealthy social circles," the anchor continued. "Tonight, we can reveal that this woman, known most recently as Ainsley Pemberton, is actually Ainsley Pemberton, a 32-year-old woman from Detroit with a documented history of marriage fraud." The elegant ballroom fell into complete silence. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as every eye turned from the television to stare at Ainsley. Her face had gone completely white. The champagne flute in her hand was trembling so violently that I thought it might shatter. "There must be some mistake," she whispered, but her voice carried in the dead silence of the room. The news report continued relentlessly. "Peterson, who has also gone by the names Ashley Pierce and Amanda Prescott, has a pattern of creating elaborate fictional backgrounds to deceive potential marriage partners from wealthy families." The television screen filled with a side-by-side comparison that made my breath catch. On the left was a professional wedding photo of Ainsley as she looked today. Platinum blonde, perfectly made up, wearing the kind of elegant expression that spoke of breeding and refinement. On the right was a mugshot of the same woman, but with dark brown hair, no makeup, and the hard, desperate look of someone who had just been arrested. DNA evidence obtained through genealogy databases has confirmed that the woman known as Ainsley Pemberton is actually Ainsley Pemberton, born in Detroit to factory workers Ronald and Marie Pemberton, both of whom are still alive and living in Michigan. Neil looked like he might collapse. He was staring at the television screen, then at his new wife, then back at the screen, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "This can't be real," he said, his voice barely audible. "Ainsley, tell them this isn't real." But Ainsley couldn't speak. She was frozen in place, watching her entire fabricated world crumble in front of everyone who mattered to her fake identity. The news report wasn't finished. "Our investigation reveals that Peterson's current deception is the most sophisticated yet. She spent months studying art history, wine, classical music, and etiquette to perfect her portrayal of old money sophistication. She even created fake family photographs using digital editing software. The screen filled with those same photos I had seen in her album, the Christmas pictures, the family portraits, the images of the supposed Pemberton estate. But now they were labeled as fabricated, in bold red letters, with arrows pointing to where Ashley's face had been digitally inserted over the real family members. A collective gasp rippled through the wedding guests. These were people who prided themselves on their ability to spot social climbers and imposters. They had been completely fooled, and they knew it. "The woman calling herself Ainsley Pemberton has no connection to any Pemberton family," the anchor continued. "The banking fortune she claims to have inherited does not exist. Her entire background, the private schools, the European travels, the family estate, All of it is fabricated. Dr. Williams, Neil's department head, spoke first. Jesus Christ, Neil. Did you know any of this? Neil shook his head mutely. He looked like a man who had just discovered that his entire life was built on quicksand. The news report moved to an interview with Sarah Chen, though the investigator's face was obscured for privacy. This type of long-term identity fraud requires incredible dedication, Sarah's voice explained. The subject studies her targets carefully, creates a persona designed to appeal to their specific insecurities and desires. She doesn't just steal money, she steals entire relationships, entire futures. How long can someone maintain this kind of deception? The reporter asked. Sometimes for years, Sarah replied, but it always falls apart eventually. The truth has a way of surfacing, especially when someone gets careless or overconfident. Overconfident. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Ashley had gotten careless tonight, so secure in her false identity that she had felt comfortable humiliating an old woman in front of everyone. She had no idea that the old woman she was dismissing had the power to destroy her. The news segment continued with interviews from Ashley's previous victims. The lawyer from Atlanta appeared on screen, his face disgusted as he recounted how Ashley had nearly convinced him to marry her before his family discovered the truth. She was perfect, he said. Everything I thought I wanted in a wife. Sophisticated, cultured, from the right kind of family. It was all lies. Every conversation we had, every intimate moment. She was playing a role the entire time. The banker's son from Charleston told a similar story. The worst part wasn't the money she took, he said. It was realizing that someone I thought I loved had never existed at all. Ainsley Pemberton created Amanda Prescott specifically to manipulate me. There was never any real relationship, just a con game. I watched Neil's face as he processed these interviews. He was beginning to understand that everything he thought he knew about his wife was a lie. Every tender moment, every shared dream, every plan for their future together, all of it had been calculated manipulation. Ashley finally found her voice, but it came out as a desperate whisper. This is insane. You can't believe this. I'm Ainsley Pemberton. I've been Ainsley Pemberton my entire life. But the evidence on the television screen was overwhelming. The news report showed Ashley's real birth certificate, her high school yearbook photo where she looked nothing like the sophisticated woman standing in the ballroom, employment records from various retail jobs she had worked before reinventing herself. Most damning of all were the emails that Sarah had uncovered. We've obtained correspondence that shows Pemberton discussing her targets with an unknown accomplice, the anchor explained. In these emails, she refers to potential marriage partners as marks and discusses strategies for maintaining her false identity. The screen filled with Ashley's own words, typed in her distinctive style. The doctor is perfect, successful enough to provide the lifestyle I want, but insecure enough about his own background to be impressed by fake pedigree. Neil read those words aloud, his voice hollow with disbelief. The doctor is perfect. She's talking about me. She called me a mark. His mother is a problem, though, the email continued. She watches me too closely. I need to find a way to minimize her influence. Every guest in the ballroom turned to look at me. Suddenly, my modest dress and simple jewelry took on a different meaning. I wasn't the embarrassing poor relation who needed to be hidden away. I was the only person who had seen through Ashley's deception. Oh my God, Neil whispered, the full implications finally hitting him. Mom, you knew something was wrong. I didn't respond immediately. I was watching Ashley, seeing the exact moment when she realized that her game was over. There would be no talking her way out of this, no convincing anyone that it was all a misunderstanding. The evidence was too complete, too public, too devastating. The news report concluded with a statement from law enforcement. We are currently investigating Pemberton for multiple counts of fraud and identity theft, a detective explained. We believe there may be additional victims who have not yet come forward. As the news segment ended and returned to normal programming, the ballroom remained in stunned silence. 300 of the city's most prominent citizens had just witnessed the complete destruction of a woman they had accepted as one of their own. Ashley was still frozen in place, her face a mask of shock and desperation. The beautiful wedding gown that had made her look like a princess now seemed like a costume, another prop in her elaborate deception. Neil finally spoke, his voice cracking with emotion. "Who are you? I mean, who are you really?" Ashley's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time since I had known her, she had no script, no rehearsed response, no perfectly crafted lie to fall back on. The silence stretched on until it became unbearable. Then, like a dam breaking, the whispers began. "Did you hear what she called his mother? She humiliated that poor woman, called her the help, and all along, she was the fraud. How could we not have seen it?" Dr. Williams approached Neil, his expression a mixture of sympathy and professional concern. "Neil, I think you need to call your attorney. This is going to be complicated." But Neil wasn't listening to professional advice. He was staring at his new wife, his fake wife, with a look of such complete betrayal that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because this was the same son who had stood silently while Ashley humiliated me. The same son who had been ashamed of me for years, who had wanted to send me away to Florida so I wouldn't embarrass him anymore. Now he understood what real embarrassment felt like. Ashley finally broke. "Neil, please," she whispered, reaching for his arm. "Let me explain." He jerked away from her touch like she was poisonous. "Explain what? Explain how you've been lying to me for 2 years? Explain how our entire relationship is a fraud?" "It's not all a lie," she said desperately. "My feelings for you are real. Everything I feel is real." "Your feelings?" Neil's voice was rising now, attracting even more attention from the guests who were still staring at the unfolding drama. "You called me a mark in your emails. You said I was insecure and easy to manipulate." Ashley's composure finally cracked completely. Tears began streaming down her perfectly made-up face, leaving tracks through her foundation. "You don't understand. I had to become Ainsley to survive. I had to create someone worthy of your world. By lying about everything, by becoming someone better than I was born to be." The raw desperation in her voice silenced the room again. For a moment, Ashley Peterson, not Ainsley Pemberton, was finally visible underneath all the carefully constructed perfection. But it was too late. The damage was done, and everyone in that ballroom knew it. As I watched my son's world collapse around him, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel: satisfaction. Not just because Ashley had been exposed, but because Neil was finally seeing the consequences of choosing appearance over substance, status over character. He had spent years being ashamed of me because I wasn't sophisticated enough for his new world. Now he would learn what it felt like to be truly humiliated, to have everyone he wanted to impress discover that his judgment had been completely wrong. The investigation I had commissioned, the DNA evidence I had arranged to surface, the perfectly timed news report, all of it had worked exactly as I had planned. Ashley Peterson had called me just the help, dismissed me as someone beneath her notice. She was about to discover that underestimating people could destroy your entire life. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Within hours of the news broadcast, Ashley Peterson's carefully constructed world began to collapse entirely. The wedding guests dispersed quickly, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, and probably calling their friends to spread the gossip before morning. Neil stood in the middle of the empty ballroom, still wearing his tuxedo, looking like a man who had lost everything in a single evening. Which, in many ways, he had. "Mom," he said finally, approaching me as I gathered my small purse. His voice was different now. Not the carefully modulated tone he had used for years, but something raw and desperate. "Mom, I need to talk to you." I looked at him calmly. "Do you? Because an hour ago, you stood there while your wife called me the help and said nothing." He flinched as if I had slapped him. I was in shock. I didn't know what to say. "You knew exactly what to say, Neil. You just chose not to say it." Ashley had disappeared during the chaos, slipping out through a service entrance when she realized that reporters were gathering outside the main doors. Neil's attempts to call her went straight to voicemail. By morning, her social media accounts would be deleted, her apartment would be empty, and Ashley Peterson would vanish just as completely as Ainsley Pemberton had been fabricated. "How long have you known?" Neil asked, slumping into one of the empty chairs. "I suspected something was wrong about 18 months ago. I knew for certain